This is Asma Kadas, and she is a Palestinian refugee from the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. This photo was taken at the funeral of her uncle, Iyad Kadas, a member of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades who was killed by the Israeli Air Force. No one can deny Asma's suffering or the anger and frustration that must have fueled her uncle. No one can deny that Palestinian refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria are suffering. Anyone who wants to solve the refugee crisis must first understand how these people became refugees and what is perpetuating their suffering today. First, let's define the word refugee. According to the UN, a refugee is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted, is outside the country of his nationality. How do people become refugees? They become refugees through conflicts and wars where people are forcibly displaced or flee to safety. My late grandmother, Safta Goldi, was a refugee from Romania after World War II. For 3 years, she did not have a permanent home, but eventually she made it to Israel in 1948 and, like hundreds of thousands of other Jewish refugees, was successfully resettled by Israel. So now let's turn to the Palestinian refugees. There are two classic narratives when it comes to the Palestinian refugees. Palestinian Authority Chairman Mahmoud Abbas wrote in a New York Times op-ed in 2011 that after the UN voted to partition the land into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, Zionist forces expelled Palestinian Arabs to ensure a decisive Jewish majority in the future state of Israel, and Arab armies intervened. War and further expulsions ensued. In essence, what he's saying is that the Jews expelled Palestinian refugees, Arab armies intervened in the refugees' defense, and war followed. Israel is at fault. On the other side of the spectrum is the classic Zionist narrative of these events, which is basically the inverse. The UN established the State of Israel alongside an Arab state. The Arabs rejected the proposal, declared war, and encouraged Palestinian civilians to vacate their homes to make way for the oncoming Arab armies. The Arabs are at fault. Well, as often is the case, the truth is more complex. In general, historians identify 4 ways these people became refugees. You see, the first group of refugees were the elite and wealthy Arabs, like those who owned this home. Right after the UN voted for the creation of 2 states side by side, these individuals and families realized the war was coming and they decided to escape, leaving for places such as Syria and Lebanon to wait out the hostilities. This group makes up a minority of the refugees. The second group is another minority of refugees made up of those who were indeed encouraged to leave by Arab commanders or on Arab radio broadcasts in the lead up to the war.
اعتادت إذاعات الأنظمة العربية القول لنا ابتعدوا عن الجبهة إنها مسألة 10 أيام أو أسبوعين على الأكثر وسنعيدكم إلى عكار.
أصدرت فتوى من قائم مقام عندنا بأنه من بقي في أرض فلسطين وفي أرض المجدل فهو خائن.
يعني اللي أطلعنا الجيش الأردني على إنه بدأ يصير معارك وإحنا بدنا نروح تحت الرجلين. قالوا لنا بتطلعوا لكم ساعتين زمان لبينما نحررها وبعدين بترجعوا. طلعنا بأواعينا يعني ما خدناش شيء لأنه بدنا نرجع بعد ساعتين ليش نحمل.
The third group are those that were expelled from their homes once the war began, such as part of this community, Lifta, on the edge of Jerusalem. Overall, less than 15% of these Arab villages were forcibly expelled by the Israeli forces. The fourth group, which makes up the majority of Arab refugees, did what so many others have done in times of war. They simply fled the conflict zone looking for a safe haven, and as a result, became refugees. To summarize, in the war of 1948, Arabs became refugees in one of 4 ways. Some of the elite and wealthy Arabs left before the war. Some left due to encouragement by the invading Arab armies. Some were expelled once the war began. And the majority fled the conflict zone looking for a safe haven. Okay, so after the war, there were roughly 700,000 Arab refugees, but today there are 5 million. This increase is unprecedented. Most refugees are resettled and their numbers decrease over time, but the Palestinian refugees' numbers have increased exponentially. So why is this group unique, and how did 700,000 become 5 million? This question takes us here, to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which was founded in 1949 specifically for Palestinian refugees. And what is peculiar is that UNRWA has a different definition for refugees, a person whose normal place of residence was Palestine between June 46 and May 48, who lost both their homes and means of livelihood as a result of the conflict. The descendants of Palestine refugee males, including adopted children, are also eligible for registration. The key word here is descendants. It means Mohammed from Lifta, who left looking for a safe haven, is a refugee, as are his 4 children in Lebanon, as are his son's 8 children who are now US citizens living in Wisconsin, none of whom may have ever seen Mohammed's hometown of Lifta. Since Palestinian refugee status is passed down to children and grandchildren, regardless of where they live, their number continues to grow, unlike any other group of refugees in the world. Now that we understand the numbers issue, let's understand why things are so bad for these refugees. The countries where some of these refugees now live have passed discriminatory laws against them. Jordan, which you can see behind me, is the only Arab country to give citizenship to Palestinian refugees from 1948, but they are still considered by many there as second-class citizens. In Syria and Lebanon, refugees do not have citizenship, are often kept in camps and barred from owning land. In Lebanon, they are barred from certain professions, like law and medicine. Their movement and healthcare is restricted, and they are rarely provided with education past primary school. This problem is exacerbated by the fact that unlike the UNHCR, which deals with all other refugees from around the world, UNRWA does not work for the resettlement of the original Palestinian refugees or their descendants, leaving them in a political, social, and economic limbo that has resulted in a host of problems. As a result, as you can imagine, there is extreme suffering in some of these refugee camps. There's poverty, sewage running in the streets. It's not a pleasant scene. It's not the situation in every camp, but again, in general, it's really not good. At this point, it is important to step back and acknowledge that the UN partition plan back in 1947 called for 2 states side by side, an Arab state and a Jewish state. If the Arabs had accepted the partition plan as Israel did, instead of attacking Israel, it's possible there would not be a single refugee today. But now I want to take another step back and talk about a different group of refugees created as a result of this war, the Jewish refugees. They fall into 3 categories. First, there is a minority of Jews who were living in areas that were allotted by the international community to the Arab state. They fled their homes and were refugees at first, but did not remain so because Israel accepted and integrated them. A second category includes Jews whose land was not apportioned to the Arab state by the UN, but who were expelled from their homes as a result of the war. This includes refugees from the old city of Jerusalem, which was taken over by Jordan, and where after generations of living there, families were uprooted and not allowed to return. But again, these refugees were accepted and integrated into Israel and did not remain refugees. The third group of Jewish refugees is by far the largest and was even larger in number than the Palestinian refugees. These former refugees can be found all over Israel, like Ronnie here, whose parents are from Iran. This group is the close to 1 million Jewish refugees who fled Muslim-majority countries like Libya, Lebanon, Tunisia, and Iraq in the years following the War of Independence. Some were expelled for being Jews. Some left due to hostility and persecution in their home countries after the Arab army's embarrassing performance in the war. If you added up the real estate they left behind, it would come out to approximately 4 times the size of the state of Israel today. They left behind billions of dollars in property, and they were never compensated. Where are these refugees today? Former Israeli Defense Minister Shaul Mofaz was born in Iran. International performer Ofra Haza was from Yemen. Even Jerry Seinfeld is the child of a Jewish refugee from Syria. So on the one hand, we have Palestinian refugees who live in terrible conditions as second-class citizens or not as citizens at all, and their numbers are skyrocketing. And on the other hand, we have even more former Jewish refugees who nowadays no one has heard of. Because like every other refugee group, aside from the Palestinians, the Jewish refugees were resettled. But the Palestinians have been barred from resettling in most of their host countries. In fact, just entertaining the idea of resettlement and integration brings up immediate backlash. Take, for example, an episode involving the outgoing director of UNRWA, Andrew Whitley. He said that because the refugees are unlikely to return to Israel as part of any agreement, the refugees should start considering their own role in the societies where they are, rather than being left in a state of limbo where they are helpless. Essentially, he is advocating the Jewish model: integrate the refugees so they can move on. But after pressure from UNRWA employees and refugees, Whitley withdrew his remarks and apologized. What makes this especially interesting is that despite the intense rhetoric against absorbing the refugees, so much progress has been made in that direction. Over 70% of UNRWA-registered refugees no longer live in camps. In Jordan, as we said, they have citizenship, their standard of living is rising, nearly equal with the rest of the population. In Syria, they've been given full access to employment and social services. Even in Lebanon, with its severe restrictions and social bias against Palestinians, over 50% are no longer confined to camps. And yet, despite all of this, Palestinians retain their refugee status. And so while significant progress has been made towards absorbing and integrating Palestinians, the reality is that no one wants to admit it or publicly support it. Why won't UNRWA, Palestinian leaders, and Arab countries that are hosting these refugees take real ownership of the problem? Is it due to discrimination within these countries against Palestinians? Is it that with 30,000 employees, it is not in UNRWA's interest to solve itself out of existence? Is it that Arab governments want to keep the issue alive, to divert attention from their own internal problems and build popular support in order to stay in power? Is the goal of Arab countries and Palestinian leaders to really solve the refugee crisis, or to perpetuate it and use it as a means of delegitimizing Israel? Surely the situation is more complicated than any one answer and different in each area. But what we can be sure of is that the international community has in the past been able to solve many refugee crises. And if the UN and Arab governments stop discriminating against Palestinian refugees and start treating them like every other refugee, we might even live to see the end of this crisis in our lifetime.